What would you make of a census book, that most ordinary of government ledgers, if one page refused explanation? No ages listed, no occupations, no acreage measured. Just 7 names written in a trembling hand, followed by a single cryptic note examined but not classified. That entry comes from Wilcox County, Alabama, dated 1880. To a clerk in Montgomery, it was probably dismissed as a clerical curiosity, another smudge in the endless stream of bureaucratic paperwork. But for those who have traced its trail through the years, that one faltering line became a doorway into one of the most unsettling mysteries in American history. A family counted once and then never again. No graves, no records of land, no trace of their bloodline in any archive. What was witnessed there the census taker could not reduce to numbers. Before we open this case together, let us pause. Share with us in the comments below the time where you are watching and the place from which you join us. These stories always live inside moments inside geography, and your presence now becomes part of that ongoing record. And if you have not yet subscribed, consider joining us, so that these forgotten histories, too disturbing for official books but too persistent to disappear, may be preserved together. Tonight, we follow the faint trail left in the margins. The vanished family of Ashford Hollow, a physician sent to count them, and the strange survival of a journal when the family themselves did not endure. The ledger begins with silence. But silence, once examined, often conceals more than any sound. In the summer of 1880, the Alabama State Board of Health dispatched physicians across the countryside to gather data on illness mortality and vaccination. The official description was plain enough: a census of rural families living beyond courthouse towns, figures destined for ledgers in Montgomery. Yet, in one case, the paperwork concealed something more. The assignment given to Dr. Samuel Whitmore of the University of Alabama began like any other enumeration of names. It would not end that way. What began as a census became something closer to an investigation he did not seek, and one that forced itself upon him. The pages he left behind no longer resemble government reports. They read instead like the testimony of a man who saw too much. Whitmore was not chosen at random. He was known among colleagues as a recorder of fact without excess. Where other doctors described epidemics with lurid detail, Whitmore wrote with restraint. His journals spoke of consumption that had hollowed out whole households with the same measured tone he used to describe seasonal fevers. He had walked through towns gutted by yellow fever, listing the dead with a calm hand even as the stench of decay hung in the air. He compared the toll of childhood mortality to casualty lists from war, noting quietly that disease claimed more than musket or cannon. That cold sobriety was precisely why the state trusted him with Wilcox County, a place few physicians cared to reach, where the task was assumed to be more about distance than danger. The directives survive in the archives: survey rural populations, record incidents of disease, assess for vaccination. They read like the driest clerical exercise. Yet in the margins of local reports in scribbled notes, never entered into official ledgers, faint traces of something else appear. Families in the southernmost hollows had not been counted in decades. Among them was one household rarely named aloud, but whispered about all the same: the Ashfords of Ashford Hollow. Their name was spoken carefully, almost reluctantly, as if uttering it too clearly might invite consequence. When Whitmore arrived in the town of Camden to gather supplies, the avoidance became impossible to ignore. At the general store, Thomas McGrady busied himself with flour sacks when asked for directions. Farmers tugged at their caps and muttered about bad roads, then changed the subject to weather. None forbade him outright. None admitted knowledge either. It was evasion honed over years, a silence practiced until it became its own kind of warning. In his notebook, Whitmore wrote, "Such absence of answer may signify not ignorance, but memory. Something here has been seen and then deliberately forgotten." Reconstruction had left Wilcox County. Divided cotton fields worked back into production on one side, wilderness creeping over abandoned land on the other. In those margins lived families who had folded inward for generations, their names missing from church registers, their lives unacknowledged in courthouse ledgers. To the state, they were blank entries. To Whitmore, they were an obligation. He approached the Ashfords as such, as names to be recorded, a family to be counted, part of the public record. Never suspecting that in trying to measure them, he would step into something that refused measurement altogether. The assignment began as a census meant to be inscribed in the steady hand of government clerks. It would end as something entirely different, preserved not in bureaucratic ledgers, but in the ink of a man who recorded what no form had prepared him to encounter. The journals tell us that Dr. Samuel Whitmore left Camden on June 14, 1880. He carried little more than his physician's satchel, a census ledger, and the directions of locals who offered them with visible reluctance. The route to Ashford Hollow was not given in miles or landmarks, but in pauses and evasions. Follow the pine road until the ground softens. Turn where the creek divides. Ride until no birds follow. These were not instructions meant to guide with precision. They carried instead the weight of warning, as if the county itself preferred the visitor to lose his way. Whitmore wrote of the journey with his usual restraint. Yet, even in his spare language, certain details break through. At first, the hills of Wilcox County appeared ordinary ridges of oak and clay, scattered with tenant plots. But as he pressed deeper, the trees gathered themselves into dense stands of longleaf pine, their tall trunks rising, like pillars in an abandoned sanctuary. The air thickened, saturated with humidity. The ground beneath his horse grew unstable, the red clay darkened by seepage from hidden springs. Most of all, he noted the creeks, shallow yet treacherous, ready to swell without warning when summer rains came. Torrents could strip the banks bare in an hour. A man cannot keep schedule in such country, he observed, for the very roads dissolve beneath him. His horse balked at these crossings, shying at shadows on the water. To Whitmore, this was his first true warning. The second came in silence. By the end of his second day, he remarked on the absence of birdsong. The summer chorus of cicadas was missing. Crickets that should have lined the roadside with endless rasping stayed mute. Even the wind which moved through the high crowns of the pines seemed muffled, as if some unseen hand pressed it down. It was here that he wrote the line, most often cited from his journal. Even the wind grew silent, where the map turned blank. Not a flourish, but a boundary marker, a way of saying that sound itself refused to follow him into the hollow. He tried, as physicians do, to rationalize. Perhaps the birds had moved for want of forage. Perhaps his horse was weary from the road. Perhaps the quiet belonged to the peculiar basin and ridge geography. But the notes reveal hesitation. He admitted his pulse quickened without cause. He confessed that he felt observed though he saw no one. The sensation reminded him of entering a surgical ward where patients waited under the hush before operation. A silence not of peace, but of suspension, as though the very air were holding its breath. By evening of the second day, he reached what looked to be a boundary fence rails of rough wood, twisted together with wire, weathered yet still standing. The ground beyond it was darker shaded not only by trees, but by some quality of atmosphere itself. Whitmore paused there. He listened for any sound at all. He heard only the hammer of his horse's heart, and even that seemed unnaturally loud. The official census record for this portion of the journey reduces everything to neutrality. Dr. Whitmore traveled into the southern hollow of Wilcox County, observing terrain and conditions, but the private journal tells another story. It speaks of a physician stepping into a geography that resisted not with hostility, but with silence, a land that concealed itself by withholding all signs of life. It was not yet the Ashfords that confronted him. It was the place itself, and the place was already speaking in absence. Whitmore's journal records his arrival at the farmhouse on June 15, 1880. Yet even this entry bears corrections, as if his hand faltered when he first tried to describe it. From a distance, the dwelling appeared unremarkable. A two-story house of pine boards with a stone chimney, no different from hundreds of others scattered through Alabama's backcountry. And yet, as he drew nearer, that sense of ordinary dissolved. The windows were not curtained in the manner of ordinary farmsteads, but sealed from within layers of cloth boards and yellowed paper pressed together as though vision itself was forbidden. The porch did not invite, but obstructed. Planks, broken chairs, and overturned tables had been nailed across its breadth, leaving only a narrow channel that forced any visitor into a single approach, a funnel with no escape. Yet, it was the garden that unsettled Whitmore most. What should have been rows of beans and corn had been permitted, or perhaps compelled to grow wild. Vines tangled into walls of green stalks rose in directions that made no sense, forming a kind of living maze. He judged it deliberate, not neglect. A system of concealment. From within, the watcher would always see first. From without, the visitor would always be seen last. At the threshold, his knock carried back strangely, as if the sound had traveled not through wood, but through a chamber, far larger than the house appeared to contain. For long minutes, there was nothing. Then came movement, dragging uneven, a shuffling rhythm that suggested limbs not in agreement with one another. The door opened by a hand's width, no more. And in that narrow aperture appeared the figure who would dominate every later page of Whitmore's notes, Jeremiah Ashford. The description is clinical, yet trembles at its edges. The skull enlarged beyond common classification, bulged upward and outward, distorting every proportion of face and brow. The eyes, set at an unsettling distance, nevertheless converged on Whitmore with unwavering steadiness. The skin bore a translucent sheen, vessels faintly visible beneath the impression less of deformity than of unfinished anatomy. The limbs bent at angles unfamiliar to human gait, yet in their very awkwardness there was suggested strength. Whitmore who had dissected bodies and catalogued disease without ornament, admitted he felt not that he was observing a malformed patient, but that he was witnessing a different anatomy altogether. The voice deepened the impression. Jeremiah did not speak in a single register, but in chords, several tones sounded together, vibrating in a way that seemed both spoken and resonant. "You've come about the counting," he said, anticipating the doctor's purpose before it was named. Whitmore had not introduced himself, yet the words carried a strange foreknowledge. In that instant, as his notes later confess, the census taker became the one examined. "I had come to number them," he wrote, "but found myself measured in turn." Jeremiah admitted him on one condition, that all which was witnessed be written truthfully, without judgment, without fear. The phrasing was unusual ceremonial even, and Whitmore committed it word for word into his ledger. From this moment, the physician's tone changes. His earlier restraint slips into guarded fascination, as if he knew the threshold he was crossing. The official census record of 1880 says only that the Ashford household was visited and surveyed. Nothing more. But the private journal reveals that in the narrow space of that barricaded doorway, the boundary between physician and subject observer and observed began to collapse. The man sent to count had been counted instead. Inside, Whitmore's first impressions were architectural. A doctor accustomed to noting the conditions of environment alongside conditions of body, he began by recording the house itself. What he found was neither farmhouse nor home in any ordinary sense. A dwelling raised to proportions not quite human, he wrote. The doorway had been widened beyond rural standards, its frame recut to admit bodies of unusual breadth. The ceilings inside rose unnaturally high, supported by crude but effective carpentry. Not decoration, but adaptation. A house continuously reworked, as if its inhabitants grew beyond what ordinary architecture could contain. The windows, sealed from outside view, revealed themselves within as barricaded apertures. Multiple layers of nailed boards, rags and newspapers blocking every trace of light. Instead, the rooms glowed from lamps of unusual size, fashioned from heavy iron fittings, strong enough to hold reservoirs larger than any household lantern. The entire structure seemed designed to close itself inward, to conceal its occupants rather than connect them to the land around. Furniture confirmed the impression. The dining table rose to nearly 4 feet, its planks thick enough to bear weight that would splinter common boards. Chairs stood taller, their joints reinforced with bolts of iron rather than wooden pegs. Beds glimpsed through open doorways resembled platforms, more than sleeping places raised on beams, constructed to support not only mass, but growth. Whitmore measured these things as a physician, noting dimensions with clinical precision. Yet in his commentary he allowed something else to slip through, an unease he could not entirely suppress. The very objects of daily life seemed shaped for another order of being, though they retained echoes of the familiar. Even the floors had been altered. Crude beams had been wedged beneath raising uneven swells where the original planks had warped under reinforcement. Rooms that should have lain square had shifted into angles, askew as if geometry itself had been bent to meet anatomical demand. Whitmore described the effect as disorienting. The eye searched instinctively for symmetry, for the comforting proportions of an ordinary home, but found instead a record of constant adjustment. The thought returned to him of the garden outside. corn twisted into barricade vines woven into concealment. Inside and out, the Ashford dwelling revealed itself as less a residence than a system of barriers, each adaptation conceding to bodies that pressed continually against the limits of construction. The census ledger would later reduce this to a phrase, farmstead, 2 stories, wood frame. But Whitmore's private journal preserved a different truth, that the very walls bore witness to generations of divergence, every beam and brace a concession to a lineage straying further from the human form. He entered the main room not to find a domestic scene, but an arrangement. The family, 7 in number, sat positioned with unmistakable deliberation, their bodies arrayed in a semicircle that suggested neither comfort nor accident. They sat in formation, Whitmore wrote, as though awaiting record. At the center presided the figure he came to designate as Mother Ashford. Her age he could not fix, though her condition was advanced beyond the others. The skull, immense and globular, had expanded to a circumference that denied natural posture. To support her, the family had fashioned a special seat, less chair than structure, its sides braced with beams to bear the weight of her head as much as her frame. She did not merely sit, she enthroned. Her gaze, too wide to converge, nevertheless struck with piercing steadiness. Flanking her were 2 adult offspring, their forms variations on Jeremiah's. One skull stretched backward in a grotesque elongation. The other widened, laterally pressing the face outward. Limbs extended beyond natural ratios, and the chairs beneath them had been built to scale enlarged, reinforced, iron-bolted. Yet, despite their distortions, Whitmore noted a strange poise, a grace within stillness, as if their bodies had long since learned the unfamiliar geometries they inhabited. The others, 3 smaller, 2 intermediate, he first assumed to be children. But closer scrutiny unsettled that judgment. Their gazes bore an intelligence far older than their size implied. Their expressions were studied, their gestures restrained. They did not resemble juveniles so much as diminished replications, iterations of their elders rendered on a smaller scale. Across them, all the common signs were unmistakable. The waxen translucence of skin, the vascular web beneath the eyes displaced too far apart. Mouths narrow yet capable of sounding chords instead of tones. Whitmore's medical instinct sought categories: hydrocephalus, acromegaly, congenital deformity, but none sufficed. "It is not affliction I observe," he wrote, "but system." What unsettled him more than their anatomy was their synchrony. Though 7 in number, they seemed aligned in perception. When he shifted stance, 7 heads turned as one. Their breathing fell into the same cadence. When a limb moved on one side of the circle, another answered with a fractional adjustment, as if all were organs within a larger body. It was Mother Ashford who addressed him first. Her voice, like Jeremiah's, carried not one tone but several layered together in harmonic accord. "You have come to fix us in the ledgers of your kind," she said, welcoming him not as visitor but as recorder. The phrasing struck Whitmore with its precision. He had come to number, yet here he was numbered in return. The census form would later mark simply Household 7. But Whitmore's private entry suggests otherwise. What he confronted was not 7 individuals, but a system, a collective presence that filled the room and pressed upon his perception. His instinct was to impose order by measurement. He unpacked his instruments: stethoscope, sphygmograph, thermometer and tape for cranial circumference with the precision of habit. Numbers he believed would steady him. Yet, the results betrayed him. The instruments recorded impossibilities he wrote, and so ceased to reassure. Jeremiah submitted first. Whitmore measured a pulse so elevated it should by all standards have proved fatal. Yet, the subject displayed no distress, speaking in his layered tones with coherence and ease. He repeated the test, even checked the stethoscope against his own chest. The figures did not change. Vital signs that ought to signify collapse instead coincided with vitality. Next, the young female presumed in her second decade, though ambiguous in growth. Her temperature shifted with each reading. At one moment, fever; at the next, hypothermia. Suspecting faulty glass, Whitmore tested the thermometer against his own skin. It proved accurate. The numbers would not stabilize. They fractured instead into contradictions. The child herself betrayed no flicker of discomfort. Her steady gaze fixed upon Whitmore as though his instruments were beneath notice. Their flesh, he recorded, is indifferent to ranges that convulse or extinguish ordinary life. Blood pressure offered still greater contradictions. His sphygmograph, crude by modern standards, but steady in its comparisons, registered levels no circulation could sustain. By every chart, limbs should have darkened, extremities failed. Yet the Ashford's hands remained warm, fingers, pink toes quick to respond. He repeated the procedure under different postures, altering conditions, but the readings refused to bend toward sense. Cranial measurements were no less unsettling. Tape drawn across their skulls yielded capacities beyond even the most extreme catalogued cases of hydrocephalus. Where such afflictions produced weakness and stupor, the Ashfords displayed the opposite alertness, sharpened into something uncanny. They finished his questions before he could phrase them. One child, without pause, recited back the very wording of his private notes, though his pen had scarcely lifted from the page. Another unbidden forecast, a storm. Clouds broke before nightfall rain, falling exactly as foretold. Whitmore's entries hold to the grammar of science numbers, decimals, ratios, but between the lines, his margin notes intrude, should be dead. Contradicts law of circulation, no category. Each instrument that had once been safeguard of certainty now delivered impossibility. He realized that the census ledger reducing the Ashfords to mere numerals, 7 members' ages, estimated health abnormal, captured nothing of truth. His own private record revealed instead the collapse of measurement itself. Where he sought order, his very tools announced its futility. What he confronted was not error but a physiology refusing classification. And in that refusal, anomaly crossed into impossibility. From here his journal shifts almost reluctantly, from figures to words, from measurements to conversation. Mother Ashford, enthroned in her reinforced chair, became not simply the subject of study, but its voice. She spoke in the polyphonic register that so unsettled him, 2 or 3 tones, layered in a single breath, yet her arguments were clear, deliberate, insistent. She began by overturning his premise. You name it disease, he recorded her saying, but it is release. Where Whitmore's hand saw deformity, she declared liberation. The swollen skulls, the translucent flesh, the elongated limbs. These were not burdens but testaments. To her they were not evidence of decline, but of escape from constraints that bound ordinary men. She called it enhancement. He wrote pathology. Their dialogue itself became a contest between vocabulary, her doctrine of freedom against his lexicon of defect. Her teachings, if his notes are to be trusted, stood upon three pillars. First, that humanity was chained by boundaries of size, frailty, brevity, artificial limits, she called them. Second, that seclusion had stripped those chains from her lineage, permitting growth beyond accepted form. And third, that their shared perception, the anticipations he had already witnessed, was not illness, but ascension, a step from isolated self toward collective mind. Whitmore strained to frame her logic, likening it to evolutionary speculation stirring in Europe, though she had no books, no contact with such theories. Her speech resembled sermon as much as science, yet her language remained anatomical, organs, blood-bone, thought. For proof, she gestured not to text, but to her children, their perfect synchrony, their seamless anticipation, their unified response as living demonstration. The self is small, she told him, but the union is vast. His journal vacillates. One line dismisses her as delusional pathology, clothed in rhetoric. The next concedes coherence, even possibility. He admitted his instruments could not disprove her. He acknowledged that their unity of gesture required explanation, that his own rising sense of anticipation, the feeling of being observed from within as much as without, might itself be evidence of their claimed perception. The census ledger again sinks to silence, head of household illiterate, religious superstition. Yet the private record preserves something else entirely, the moment where science and prophecy collided. To his training, the Ashfords were deformity. To themselves, they were emancipation. Between those two definitions stretched a gulf his measures could never bridge. His journals mark June 20th, 1880, as the evening he was first admitted to what they named their parlor. Nothing within resembled an ordinary sitting room. The walls stripped bare were lined with shelves built into the boards. Upon them rested glass vessels, each filled with a pale fluid in which floated unmistakably human forms, unfinished, suspended between potential and decay. Some children, he wrote with trembling hand, are born in glass and choose never to leave it. The specimens varied. Some no larger than an infant's hand, skulls already swollen to the family's proportions. Others nearly full-term limbs, elongated skin, translucent even through the preserving liquid. Some jars appeared newly filled tissues, still pink fluid clear. Others had stood for decades, glass-clouded contents, yellow with age. But what unstrung Whitmore's reason was not their preservation, it was their motion. Against every medical law, the embryos stirred. Tiny hands flexed. Mouths opened and closed. Limbs shifted in the sluggish rhythm of breath. The Ashfords gathered once more in their semicircle, this time before the shelves of glass. One by one they inclined their vast, distorted heads, not in prayer to altar or scripture, but in solemn regard for the suspended forms within the jars. The silence deepened, broken only by the creak of their chairs and the faint tapping of fluid against glass as the specimens stirred in answer. Whitmore described it not as worship, but as communion. They did not beseech, they conferred. Mother Ashford's voice, layered, resonant, unmistakable, explained. These are the children who chose not to be born into limitation. To her, those drifting forms had declined the burden of flesh, choosing instead to remain preserved in liquid, their essence absorbed into the family's collective awareness. Each jar, she insisted, contained not only tissue, but consciousness fragments of growing mind that bound them together. Whitmore's pen strained toward detachment, yet tremor leaked through his notes. He recorded how the embryos stirred in synchrony, with her words, their minute motions, coinciding with the cadence of her layered speech. He marked how the living Ashford's breathing aligned as the specimens flexed, how 7 pairs of eyes widened at once as if receiving some internal signal. It is less the preservation of bodies, he wrote, than the cultivation of thought. His training rebelled. Embryos could not survive outside the womb, let alone respond with intent. Yet, nothing in medicine accounted for what he saw. He tried to dismiss the movements as the settling of fluids, but the patterns were too deliberate, too responsive. The gestures were not random. They were acknowledgements, silent exchanges between flesh-born and flesh withheld. The census ledger, of course, holds no trace of this scene. It exists only in the unsteady script of Whitmore's private journal, where he confessed to feeling observed not by the family alone, but by the jars themselves, as though unseen minds pressed upon his own. Birth and death no longer define life here, he admitted. They have rewritten both, cultivating existence in a state neither wholly within the world nor wholly outside it. By his second week in Ashford Hollow, Whitmore's notes turned from physiology to cognition. Having measured their bodies, he began to chronicle occurrences that eluded instruments yet demanded record. The Ashfords did not rely on speech, though their mouths moved when convention required it. More often, voices reached him where lips never stirred. He described conversations that leapt across the room in silence, replies arriving before his questions formed. Jeremiah, seated by the hearth, would finish sentences that had existed only in Whitmore's mind. A child no larger than 8 in appearance spoke aloud to a query he swore had not left his tongue. At first he blamed coincidence, but repetition dissolved denial. "My reflections are anticipated," he wrote. "My intentions answered before utterance. I am not separate in this house." Even the jars joined the discourse. On June 23rd, Whitmore attempted an experiment. He stood before a clear vessel and resolved to think, not speak, the word movement. At once the embryo flexed its tiny arm, sending ripples across the fluid. When he shifted thought to stillness, the motion ceased. He repeated the trial again and again with the same result. His conclusion tentative yet inescapable. The preserved forms were not inert remains, but participants in a wider field of perception. Mother Ashford confirmed with calm assurance what his instruments could not. Her harmonic voice declared that each member of the family, embodied or unborn, added to a singular mind. "We do not lose ourselves," she told him. "We enlarge ourselves." Whitmore underlined the phrase in his notebook as though recognizing its weight, even while resisting its truth. Reports of their knowledge further unsettled him. A son spoke of rainfall in Montgomery, hours before a telegram confirmed the storm. A daughter recited a theory, printed that very month in a Boston journal, no one in Wilcox County could have seen. Whitmore tried to dismiss these as fabrications, but their precision eroded every defense. They possess information without transmission, he wrote. And what they possess, they share. The census ledger reduced cognition to silence numbers, ages, conditions of health. But the private notes record a household functioning as a single organ of perception, diffused across bodies and even into glass. He struggled for terms, family brood system, and found none sufficient. What remained beyond doubt was the effect upon himself. He began to sense their motions before they occurred to dream in choruses rather than voices. "I am counted among them," he admitted uneasily, "though I have not consented." Thus, his record changed course. No longer a ledger of anatomy alone, but of consciousness shared, indivisible, and unbound. By late June, his entries reveal a man no longer observing from without, but pulled into the very field he sought to measure. The Ashfords did not speak only of themselves, but of others stretching their story far beyond the hollow that confined them. "We are not alone," they claimed. Whitmore even set that phrase apart in the margin as though his disbelief required a separate note of warning to himself. According to Mother Ashford, their condition was not unique. Other families across the South, she said, had undertaken the same path of secrecy, isolation, and inheritance. She named valleys in Kentucky where kin married kin until entirely new anatomies appeared. She spoke of the Tennessee mountains where households abandoned both town and church living apart. She whispered of the swamps of Georgia where hidden settlements concealed their own altered progeny. Each of these enclaves, she insisted, was part of a greater lattice, connected not by letters or roads, but by intent. A quiet, deliberate cultivation of a human form, freed from ordinary limits. Whitmore's skepticism, sharpened by medical training, pressed against her words. He recognized the patterns she described in breeding, hereditary disease, deformities, phenomena well documented in medical literature. Yet what she spoke of was more than accident. It bore the structure of design. Breeding is not misfortune, she declared. It is method. His notes preserve a phrase that unsettled him, deeply repeated often during these conversations. "We are experiments, but not failures." The suggestion was horrifying that across generations, families had embraced their divergence, shaping it consciously. They had chosen exile as laboratory. Whitmore demanded sources for such knowledge. How could a woman who had never left a hollow in Alabama describe communities hundreds of miles away? The reply came in unison. "We know because we are joined." Evidence pressed on him in ways he could not dismiss. A boy barely 10 years old recited the names of Kentucky counties with perfect accuracy, though he had never left Wilcox. Another corrected Whitmore's geography of northern Georgia, naming rivers he later confirmed on state maps. None of this knowledge came from books. There were no books in the house. Instead, the family insisted it flowed through a cognition that spanned households' distance and bloodlines. Whitmore recorded his doubt. Perhaps collective delusion could explain their shared detail, but he also recorded a concession. They possess information inaccessible to their circumstances. His ledger of anomalies now stretched beyond anatomy into geography and sociology. He was perhaps documenting communities never before counted. Families linked not by law or commerce, but by secrecy and intention. The census made no mention of such things. To Montgomery, the Ashfords were 7 individuals in a remote hollow. Yet Whitmore's private journal preserved their larger claim that they were but one node in a hidden web, each family contributing to what they described as the growing mind of the South. His entry for June 28th closed with a line written in a hand less steady than before. "The hollow is not the end of my task. It is the beginning of a map not drawn on paper, but inscribed in bloodlines hidden from the record." By July of 1880, Whitmore's tone shifted. Where his earlier entries had been marked by precise measurement and detached language, a new subject crept in himself. He had come to record the family, but as his later words reveal, he kept recording until the family began to record him. The first changes were subtle, almost deniable. He described an ache at the base of his skull, blaming sleeplessness and long hours at his desk. Days later, he measured his cranial circumference and found it increased by half an inch. The following week, another increase. His handwriting grew unstable as the new shape of his head altered his posture. His skin, too, changed. In lamplight, it showed a pallor unfamiliar, even to him a translucence through which blue-green veins became visible. He dismissed it as fever until daylight proved it persistent. My reflection no longer corresponds with my recollection, he wrote. The more troubling changes, however, were not of flesh, but of perception. He began to anticipate weather with uncanny precision, predicting thunderstorms to the hour without instruments. On July 8th, he described an image that entered his mind, a steamboat collision on the Alabama River. 2 days later, confirmation arrived by courier the event had occurred exactly as he foresaw. Awareness not my own presses into thought. He confessed, then struck the words through as though ashamed, but allowed them to remain visible. His dreams grew vivid. He saw himself elongated skull, vast skin, translucent, standing among the Ashfords as one of them. His dream voice carried the same harmonics he dreaded in theirs. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, only to find the family silently watching as if they too had seen. By mid-July, his distance as observer eroded. He knew what Mother Ashford would say before she spoke, answered questions before they were asked. He felt his pulse sync with theirs, his breath matching theirs without conscious effort. I find my pulse matching theirs, though no hand guides it. But my own, he wrote in disbelief. The official census ended his report abruptly unfinished. But in the private journal, preserved by accident and secrecy, Whitmore's individuality dissolved line by line. His measurements turned inward. The census taker merged with the specimen. The hollow, which had absorbed generations of Ashfords, now reached outward to claim its recorder. By late July, resistance was gone. His notes carried a tone of recognition. Measurements of his own body no longer reassured, they became evidence of progress toward a state he could not halt. His expanding skull changed the fit of his hat. His translucent skin forced him to shun the sun, his entries describing pain at the touch of daylight. Most terrifying was the fading boundary of self. He recorded thoughts half-formed, answered aloud by the family. Dreams so vivid, they persisted into waking. Moments when he could not tell whether perception belonged to him or to the collective mind around him. It was then, he wrote, that Mother Ashford gave her final assurance. The entry is brief, yet unambiguous. Return was never part of their design. Her voice, resonant, layered, explained what his body already knew. Assimilation was not failure, it was fulfillment. The changes in his body, Mother Ashford insisted, were neither infection nor the accident of proximity. They were intention. Exposure itself was the mechanism by which outsiders were absorbed, drawn inward into the collective mind. You cannot return to solitude, she told him, for solitude no longer exists within you. Whitmore attempted to resist. He wrote of science as a tool for correction of pathology, as something to be diagnosed and reversed. But Mother Ashford countered each claim with the undeniable evidence of his own body. His awareness already matched theirs. his pulse synchronized with theirs. Even his reflections had entered their chorus. She reminded him of lines from his own journal sentences he had written days earlier that now seemed to bear more than one hand. In the margin he confessed, "Even my records are not my own." The census taker who had once catalogued deformity now found himself catalogued. He described the process with the clinical detail of a physician, even as he admitted his disintegration as an individual. "I retain memory," he wrote, "but not identity. My thoughts are mirrored before they are complete. What I call mine is already ours." The distinction between observer and specimen collapsed. The family framed his transformation not as tragedy, but as fulfillment. Mother Ashford spoke of evolution not as a gradual process stretching across centuries, but as immediate inheritance passed through blood proximity and thought. Each addition to the family, whether by birth or assimilation, expanded the reach of their collective mind. Whitmore was not guest nor prisoner, but participant. His role, she told him, was to serve as bridge his medical knowledge, preserved yet no longer belonging to him alone. The official census never recorded this exchange, but the private journal carried its traces, sentences trailing off, words, unfinished handwriting, widened and uneven as his altered hands failed to guide the pen. He ceased writing of they. He wrote of we. The pronouns slipped into his vocabulary, unbidden confirmation that assimilation was not disease but strategy. Whitmore had entered as recorder. He remained as proof once crossed the boundary between ordinary man and Ashford mind could not be retraced. Nearly 80 years later, in the summer of 1958, the Ashfords returned to record once more. This time not through rumor but excavation. A highway crew south of Camden struck the ruins of a forgotten homestead. The farmhouse had collapsed long ago, swallowed by vine and soil. But beneath its debris lay something that resisted decay. Workers uncovered a cellar carved deep into the hillside, sealed by stonework and packed clay. Its interior remained unnervingly preserved. When investigators from the Alabama State Highway Department entered, they did not find storage for food or tools. They found a laboratory. The chamber stretched 20 feet, its walls lined with shelves bearing rows of glass containers. Within them floated human forms, embryos suspended in clear preservation fluid that had not clouded with age. Each bore the same traits Whitmore described in 1880: cranial enlargement, translucent skin. Alongside them lay 19th century medical instruments, thermometers, calipers, a stethoscope, and a leather physician's bag stamped faintly with the initials SW. Its contents remained neatly arranged, as though waiting for his return. More disturbing still were the journals. Dozens of volumes swollen by damp, but still legible. The early entries showed the careful script of Samuel Whitmore. Later pages unraveled into sprawling scrawl lines, thickened as though written by hands too altered to control the pen. The state summoned Dr. Margaret Chen, a forensic anthropologist, to analyze the material. Her preliminary report, later sealed in a closed session of the Alabama State Medical Board, described embryonic forms that defied known pathology. These specimens display cranial expansions consistent with hydrocephalus, she wrote, yet neural tissue is preserved in ways that suggest enhancement, not deterioration. Some jars carbon dated belonged to the 1880s. Others were decades younger, their tissues impossibly intact. The fluids themselves resisted explanation. remaining clear after 70 years. Chen observed, "This is not death in suspension but growth arrested in a state we cannot classify." Her conclusion that the Ashfords had pursued systematic genetic experimentation generations ahead of accepted science was judged too incendiary for publication. The report was suppressed, circulated only within sealed files of state and federal offices. The journals confirmed her suspicions. Whitmore's writing, once precise medical record, devolved into commentary on communion with the family and his own assimilation. "My skull circumference increases without pain. My perception extends beyond the hollow. I am no longer singular," one late entry reads. Another, nearly illegible, describes the preserved embryos not as experiments but as seeds awaiting the right conditions to sprout. The official archives filed the 1958 discovery blandly as biological material of undetermined classification. But in restricted vaults, the truth remained the physician's bag, the erratic journals charting his dissolution, and rows of glass containers where children never born seemed to wait in silence. Rumor had hardened into evidence. The hollow whispered about in Wilcox County for generations was no longer myth. Its family had not only lived but labored toward a design that exceeded the boundaries of human science. Federal authorities quickly assumed control. Declassified documents decades later revealed the unease pages stamped confidential testimony blacked out by censors. Maps marked with symbols absent from public atlases. One line from Agent William Crawford's 1960 memorandum encapsulates the investigation, where files close tunnels begin. Beneath the farmhouse and its cellar, Crawford's team found shafts cut into bedrock, precise and deliberate. The tunnels connected chambers large enough to host gatherings. Their timber supports still intact, the air stale but breathable. On the walls, investigators found geometric carvings, spirals intersecting lines, patterns too deliberate to be dismissed as accident. No surviving file offers a key to their meaning. The surface also bears the marks of disturbance. A cemetery in a pine forest with crude headstones carved with only a few lines and numbers. Dates back nearly a century. Yet soil surveys and excavations show that many graves have been dug up and reburied multiple times. Coffins show signs of being removed and replaced, and in some cases, the remains inside do not match the names engraved on the outside. Crawford once described it as a circulation system, though that phrase was later dropped from the official report. The implication is clear: the Ashfords did not view burial as a finality, but as a storage facility. Organic samples from both the grave and the underground vault resisted classification. Tissue samples showed no cellular decay, though carbon dating confirmed they were from the 19th century. A glass jar buried under a collapsed beam contained a mass of nerve fibers as thin as a tree root, and it reacted weakly to light. Labs failed to replicate the effect. The specimen coded A17 remained in the internal files with the note unexplained. The Crawford report also noted signs that the site had never been completely abandoned. The beds in the underground chambers appeared to have been recently used. Ashes in the fireplace showed signs of burning within the past year. Farmers in neighboring counties told of flickering lights on the hills, lurking figures at dusk, and herds of cattle disappearing without a trace of predators. These testimonies never entered the official records but were kept in Crawford's appendix. The state's conclusion in 1961 The Ashfords had not been buried with the collapsed house, but had retreated deeper into a system designed to conceal them. The tunnels, the graves, and the unclassifiable specimens were seen as evidence of continuity, a family that survived by hiding underground and in the records. The report concluded with a recommendation: continue, secret surveillance, absolutely no publicity to avoid panic. The land in the area was declared unsuitable for development and transferred to a private foundation. But in the sealed records, the pattern emerged: families evolving in the shadows over generations. Their presence was marked not by what was found, but by what always resisted final explanation. The Ashford Hollow case ended not with a conclusion, but with an absence. The lab was catalogued, the tunnels mapped, the graves measured. But the living people were never found. The official record stopped in 1961. What remained was fragmentary Forrester accounts, personal letters, notes on the periphery that never made it into the state archives. All of this overlapped, drawing the idea that disappearance does not mean extinction. In 1974, a ranger reported discovering a clearing strewn with headstones deep in the Willow Pine Forest. The crude graves were dated at a time that did not match the map. One grave had been recently dug up, the soil still fresh, but there were no signs of a shovel. By 1982, hunters reported encountering tall, pale figures whose eyes reflected light at unusual angles. As they approached, the figures quietly disappeared into the forest. More difficult to discern are the dream reports. Visitors, many of them ignorant of the history of the place, say that at night they dream of unusually long heads, translucent skin, and a chord of voices that resonates in multiple layers. Some wake up to find their heartbeats synchronized with those of their companions. Others suddenly know the weather is about to change. These experiences have been publicly denied, but they echo Whitmore's own first description in 1880. The final piece of evidence, if it can be called evidence, is contained in a diary found in the root cellar. The last entry, dated October 3rd in the 1880, reads, "My skull has increased in circumference by 4 inches since I came here. I hear thoughts that are not mine. Mother Ashford says I am at the threshold where the self expands to merge into the whole. We have become what humanity was meant to be. The writing wavers, stretches, and crumbles until the page turns into vague shapes, half letter, half symbol. The very dissolution of the writing, archivists say, reflects the process it describes, the individual dissolving into something larger, less definable. There is no solid evidence that the Ashford family still exists. The land is now privately owned, protected by a conservation sign, off limits to the public. But the people around still tell stories, lights glimmering on the hills, cattle that die without wounds, dreams that begin with just setting foot in the valley. These stories never enter the records, but their persistence suggests that the story is never finished. So the Ashford Hollow file ends in limbo. Science records anomalies that defy classification. Diaries reveal a doctor who slipped from his observation post to become the subject himself. The land remains silent. Whether the clan is extinct or still hidden deep in the mazes of the south, no one can say for sure. What remains is the implication that they belong not only to the past, but perhaps to the future. That another form of humanity may have taken root long ago beyond the reach of all senses.